100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, giving women the right to vote. Over the last century, we have seen incredible change in our country. Today, women outnumber men in voter registration in Frederick County and all across our great nation. The people who hold public office in our community now look more like those we represent. Women hold the offices of county executive and county council president, and they hold elected seats on the county council, the Board of Education, our delegation to the Maryland General Assembly, the City of Frederick's Board of Aldermen, and several other governing bodies. 7 of our municipalities have had females at the helm, including the current mayor of Burkittsville, Debbie Burgoyne, who's held that office for 13 years. With the power of the vote, women continue to make history. We owe much of that to those who came before us: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Hattie Purvis, Lucretia Mott, and many more, women who were determined to make a difference. And now I'd like to read a proclamation to recognize this important milestone. Whereas, after decades of public education, legislative lobbying, and public demonstrations by women's suffrage organizations of all ages, races, and states, Congress passed the 19th Amendment to the United States, providing that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. And this passed on June 4, 1919. And whereas Tennessee was the 36th and last required state to ratify passing the legislation, and did so by just one vote on August 18, 2020. Women of all colors registered to vote in the northern states, but the right was not recognized for women of colors in many states until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And whereas I commend the progress made over the past century to achieve equality for all citizens of our beloved nation, and to encourage the many civic organizations that have worked diligently to expand the roles of voter registration in our community, their work is certainly helping to ensure a bright future for Frederick County. So now, therefore, as the County Executive of Frederick County, Maryland, I hereby proclaim August 18, 2020, as 19th Amendment Day in Frederick County, and commend this observance to all of our citizens. And it's signed by me, Jan Gardner, Frederick County Executive, and presented this 18th day of August 2020, 100 years of the women's right to vote.
100 years ago, in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was approved when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify giving women the right to vote. But the struggle was far from over. Full voting rights for many women did not come until years later. It wasn't until Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that women were finally guaranteed the right to vote in every state in the Union. Before the passage of that landmark bill, many states found loopholes in the 19th Amendment that they used to restrict women's ability to fully exercise their voting rights. States levied poll taxes or put policies in place requiring literacy tests before allowing anyone to vote, thereby denying many, particularly African Americans, Native Americans, and others, their fundamental voting rights. The suffrage movement has historically been portrayed as a middle-class white movement, with leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But it would be a mistake to not also recognize the contributions of women from the African American community, like abolitionist Sojourner Truth, journalist Ida B. Wells, poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and educator Mary McLeod Bethune. There were also women from the Native American community who stepped up to meet the challenge of advocating for voting rights for women, such as Mary Louise Batineau Baldwin from the Chippewa Indian community, and Zicala Sa, known as Gertrude Simmons Bonin, the name given to her by missionaries from the Sioux Indian community. The involvement of women of color in the movement has largely been ignored until recently, when more research into the history of the movement turned up evidence of their early and continued advocacy. To quote the University of Maryland historian Dr. Robin Munsey, it's important to remember how piecemeal a struggle it was. Seeing change as coming in one fell swoop undermines us as citizens and gives us a false idea about the way change happens. It was a piecemeal movement. It was a struggle. It took decades and the relentless ongoing efforts of many people from very diverse backgrounds to accomplish the goal, and yet, today, 100 years later, as we gather to commemorate this momentous occasion, Full access to our electoral system for all citizens is still being threatened and in some places seriously undermined for certain groups of people. We must remain vigilant against efforts to limit or restrict voting rights for anyone entitled to vote. Dr. Munsey stated it was important to see the 19th Amendment not as a triumphant culmination, but one landmark in a struggle for equal rights for all citizens that isn't over yet. So what does voting rights for women mean for me today? It means quite a lot, since if women didn't have the right to vote, they clearly would not be afforded the right to hold elected office, and therefore I wouldn't be here standing in front of you. But voting rights came with recognition of other rights of women, that women were equal to, or at least as good as men. When my mother was growing up, women were not allowed to take out credit or even get a credit card without a man co-signing. She went to college at a time when most of her classmates, if they went to college at all, left before finishing their degrees because they were really only sent to college to get their MRS, not an actual BA or a BS. She graduated with a BS in chemistry and a BA in English. She instilled in me, as well as my siblings, that women were just as able as men and could do any job if they put their mind to it. That was almost heresy for someone in her generation. But for that reason, my siblings and I have never put limits on our dreams nor on our aspirations. And that is something you don't think about when you talk about voting rights for women. So that one change, giving women the right to vote, brought about a whole list of other changes, recognizing the rights of women and people across this country, rights that sometimes we take for granted. But it also means that we, as inheritors of those rights, must make sure we are protected, make sure that they are protected. We cannot get complacent or let down our guard. We must instill in each subsequent generation how incredibly important, how critical the right is to vote for all future generations, and we must do whatever we can to ensure its continuity. So as we celebrate this incredible achievement 100 years after the fact, we also recognize its fragility, and we must recognize how much further we still have to go as a community, as a people, and as a country. The best way to continue this progress is to exercise your right and make sure that you vote in November and in every election thereafter. In this way, you will ensure the continuity and the advancement of our country, and you will thank our fellow women and some men for their efforts so many years ago.
I am honored to help Frederick County commemorate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Suffragists began their organized fight for women's equality in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and for the next 72 years they marched, lobbied, picketed, and protested until the 19th Amendment was finally ratified by Tennessee on August 18, 1920, the last state needed for it to be officially added to our Constitution. We know, however, that many states went on to pass laws precluding Black and Indigenous women of color from voting. And Black women like Nannie Helen Burroughs and Sojourner Truth, who were fearlessly outspoken during the women's suffrage movement, are often left out of our history books. Now, 100 years later, we are still fighting for equal voting rights. Voter suppression is happening across the country. Early voting is being limited or eliminated, polling places are moved, voter ID laws disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. In recent months, we've even seen people forced to choose between protecting their health and protecting their right to vote, as they waited in long lines during the biggest public health crisis of our time. So, on this centennial anniversary of women's suffrage, I ask you to join me in making sure all of us have a voice and a vote. Make sure your friends and family are registered to vote and have an updated address on file. Help them request a mail-in ballot for November's election to make sure they can vote safely. You can find everything you need at elections.maryland.gov. When women vote, we hold the power to determine our future.